Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this sponsored Devex webinar called Land Matters, Making New Solutions Possible Through Technology. I'm Jeff Tyson, Global Development Reporter at Devex, and I'll be your moderator today. Securing land rights and resource rights is critical for social and economic growth and will be essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Research from KPMG and Thomson Reuters suggests that sustainably modernizing governance structures through technology can help to secure and protect land rights, which can in turn benefit households, countries, and governments. Through this webinar, we will discuss the link between land rights and sustainable development with a particular focus on a recent study in the city of Cape Town, South Africa. Today's webinar is hosted as part of our series Focus on Land Matters, sponsored by Thomson Reuters. Unfortunately, our speaker from the U.S. Agency for International Development was not able to join this morning's webinar, but during our discussion, we'll hear from experts from Thomson Reuters and KPMG who will touch on their research into land rights, technology, and sustainable development. Our first speaker is Christopher Barlow, who is the Director of Strategic Relations and Communications at Thomson Reuters. His work focuses on promoting land administration and property tax solutions for governments around the world. He has worked in China, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and Mongolia on land information systems and mapping projects. And our second speaker is Trevor Davies, who is Global Head of the International Development Assistance Services Center of Excellence at KPMG. Trevor has over 20 years of experience providing public sector reform and financial management, as well as economic development services to development agencies. He has worked in Angola, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and many other developing countries. I'd now like to hand it over to Christopher Barlow, who will kick off our presentation. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here with you today. Importantly, we see that there is a growing evidence-based understanding of how investments in land administration can be achieved through sustained development and wealth accumulation for peoples and communities with the right investment approaches. And, we're very pleased to be a part of this conversation and also this movement on why land matters for development. So thank you for having me with you today. So as I get started, let me advance the right slide here. I've been reading this book recently, Jeff, on by a Princeton University professor, Professor Deaton. He's a recent Nobel laureate. And he is explaining and arguing in this book that there is a chronic lack of state capacity, which is undermining what poor countries need most, and that's specifically an effective government. He's quite radical in his statements, provocative, and he's saying that the problem isn't necessarily that there is a lack of aid development dollars. Rather, it's effective tax revenue. And he explains in this book that there is essentially a social contract between a government and citizens when it comes to taxes. And if you look at the roots of democracy, it's really the intersection between what is paid to a government by citizens for public goods and the representation from those citizens and the demand for representation by those citizens for their government on how that revenue will be allocated. Professor Deaton argues here that the strong institutions are required to ensure trust in what he calls the social contract. And I think this is very much in line with our philosophy at Thomson Reuters, how we engage with governments, but also how we engage with development partners as well. If you look at the global landscape of property tax revenue, for instance, and OECD and Lincoln Land Institute has done some very good studies on this, you see that there's a very significant gap between what OECD nations collect in terms of property taxes versus what emerging nations are collecting. So this illustration I have here in front of us today shows that OECD nations are collecting 2.12% of their GDP from property taxes, whereas in emerging nations it's 0.6%. So this is a very significant revenue gap that exists in terms of what's being collected for property taxes. And it's really property taxes that we see are an engine for sustainable growth in communities. Property taxes enable and empower governments to fund and sustain local growth, the building of roads, improvement of public services, and financing of education. In fact, in a country like the UK, more than 90%, upwards of 95% of local taxes are collected from property taxes. In the United States, it's somewhere around 70%. These taxes support institutional strengthening up and down the governance line, as the tax provides the base to annually fund and maintain institutions, and is also a revenue stream from which governments may borrow money for infrastructure development and upgrades. And once the land administration is established, economic and social development may flourish. Yet today, we know that there's a very stark issue when it comes to land administration and land rights. If we look at the broader picture of what the land sector looks like today, we see that a majority of lands, a large majority of lands in developed countries, have no mapped or recorded rights. The UN Habitat estimates that 70% of land in the developing world does not have mapped, recorded, or documented rights. Too many people live today without the security that the land that they occupy, the land that they rely upon to farm crops, to feed their families, will not suddenly be lost to them. And in too many places in the world today, the practices to record, document, and map tenure rights have changed very little in hundreds of years. For many, security of land tenure is a spoken rather than a recorded tradition. Yet we also know from our experience that there are exponential gains from sustained land administration. And these exponential gains equate to more wealth accumulation for individuals and also revenue gains for the governments in communities. And there is a growing evidence-based understanding of why land matters to modernization and why land matters to development. Indeed, a recent paper by the World Bank looked at the impact land demarcation had on agricultural households' investment decisions in Benin. These researchers found that by mapping and delineating property boundaries, individual households were more likely to invest in perennial cash crops rather than subsistence crops. This is very significant as it shows a connection between land tenure security and microeconomic investment behavior. So simply by having their lands properly mapped, demarcated, the boundaries drawn in these communities in Benin, the World Bank is showing that those individuals are making different investment decisions on what crops they're growing. So long-term crops versus short-term gain. Yet before realizing these benefits, communities, governments need to improve the quality of the information that they're providing and collecting. This includes identifying, documenting, and recording who owns what lands, where those lands are located, and with what rights those lands have. This information is very much the fabric of our society, as rights are interwoven with the rights of other members of society. They can then be aggregated for the benefit of larger society by government so that the information is shared, analyzed, and assessed for multiple stakeholders of society. And we're talking about market transparency. We're talking about the fundamentals of the real estate market here. For instance, if we look at the U.S., it's estimated that upwards of a quarter of our economy is committed to real estate. If you look at Nigeria, the Nigerian finance minister, the previous finance minister, Minister Ngozi, had estimated that in Nigeria it was only 3% of GDP. But what defines good governance for us? It really equates to the public sector establishing and maintaining institutions that have defined rights, that has made information freely and openly available for multiple stakeholders in society. This is very much in line with what Professor Deaton is saying about effective government institutions in the social contract. At Thomson Reuters, we have partnered with hundreds of governments on all continents, both in a direct-to-government capacity and also with aid agencies and lender organizations to support modernizing land administration and tax systems and processes. We develop and deploy technical systems to support modernization. Here today we will be sharing one example of this from Cape Town, South Africa. Specifically in Cape Town, we have been working with the government there for more than 10 years. And this is an example of how one jurisdiction has modernized their land administration foundation. And we're very pleased to have our partner here at KPMG, who we have engaged with to look at the example of Cape Town so that we may better understand how this particular jurisdiction has been able to achieve results for its peoples and communities by strengthening that underlying administrative foundation of land, information, and property. And by, importantly, improving the trust to what Professor Devex referred to as that social contract with its citizens, namely the ability to collect tax and then deliver services in return for the public good. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Trevor from KPMG.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you to everyone at Devex for organising this call this morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I have to say, the thanks for actually producing this piece of work very much go to the City of Cape Town, and particularly the Valuation Department, for the excellent cooperation and access that they provided to our team, which was led by Lisa Gahan from KPMG South Africa. I think they were very open, they were very engaged, and I think that certainly their cooperation led to the output of the project being so successful. So just a little bit of background then. I think we were approached in 2014 by Thomson Reuters to take a look at the implementation by the City of Cape Town, the Valuation Department, of a new valuation module. I think one of the things that immediately struck me about that was that it's quite unusual for a private sector company, particularly a company which is providing an IT solution, to ask for an independent review to be carried out of the impact, not just the technical impact, but more broadly the impact that it's having on the city and indeed on the citizens within the city. And at first I was quite interested to understand the thinking that Thomson Reuters had for potentially commissioning the piece of work. What became very clear from working with Chris and his colleague Robert Bergenthal, who was instrumental in this, is I think as an organisation they're very clear, as you heard from Chris, that land tenure security is absolutely a fundamental element in actually reaching a wide range of development outcomes. And this has actually been reflected, I think, in the SDGs in a number of ways, whether it be as an underpin to SDG 1 or number 8 on sustainable inclusive growth, or indeed SDG 11, which actually looks at sustainable cities. So I think it's very useful to actually see a private sector company actually being prepared to actually take a look at what's going on and what the impact is. I think it's very critical that land tenure, as Chris said, is an issue in developing countries which really needs to be tackled with some urgency. It very much is an important underpin to economic growth. And it's very clear from other work that we've been doing with the Change Readiness Index, which is a tool that we've developed, that land and land management and inclusive growth are very much important underpins to sustainable growth and sustainable development in countries. So if we talk a little bit about the project then, in terms of the scope of the project, we were asked to undertake a pilot impact study of the use of the new Momentum Valuation module by the City of Cape Town. We were looking a number of years after the project was successfully implemented, and I would just say for the impact evaluation purists out there that I don't think you could call this an impact evaluation in the same sense that you might see on a very large development funded project. I think the idea here was to go in to construct a baseline because there was no original baseline in place for the implementation, other than very much a technical baseline. And I think that in itself has been a useful finding from the study. And I know colleagues at Thomson Reuters are now actually looking at how they can build a much more broader community and societal baseline into these implementations rather than it just being a technically focused implementation. And I think that in itself is a very useful output from the study. In terms of the value of the study, the idea was to actually look much more broadly than you would traditionally do on an IT implementation and look at the effectiveness, the relevance and the efficiency of the system. It was to help both the valuation department and more broadly the City of Cape Town actually understand the system and understand how it was contributing to improving land tenure security in the city. And also, as I've already mentioned, it was to help actually refine future interventions. So to actually think about what's been done so far, but what are the lessons that have actually been learned from this that can be applied to other implementations in other cities, states and countries, or indeed how the City of Cape Town could actually enhance the way in which they're using the existing system. And finally, to actually share that knowledge among the city government departments and more broadly to enable more efficient citywide planning. So in terms of the project, we looked at the impact at three main levels. Firstly, at the departmental level, which was the most obvious and most immediate level. That was the valuation department. Secondly, looking more broadly at the city and the benefit or not that the city had received from the project. And finally, looking more broadly at a societal level or community level to look at how this impacted the various, the community within Cape Town. We also looked at the impact in three ways. Firstly, looking at what was directly attributable impact. So in other words, what impact was a direct result of the city using this particular piece of software. Secondly, we looked at contributing impact because I think it was very clear in looking at this that in some cases there was a bit of a chicken and egg situation. The city's decision to actually bring in certain new policies and processes and indeed to change the way in which the valuation department operated then led to a decision to look at a piece of software to actually support that change. Equally, the software and the data and the information that flowed from that fed back into that process, which shone a light on some of the policies and actually enabled the city to actually look at how they could continue to further refine that process. And the third area is what we call potential impact. There are areas where when we looked at the data that was available, we could see that there was far more use that the city could make of the information than they were currently making. And that was something that we also identified in the report. So just briefly then, just to sort of put this in some context, I mean, the City of Cape Town, just under 3.8 million population in 2011 when the system was implemented. Just over a million houses, of which 129,000 were informal structures and informal settlements. And about 36% of the households were actually below the South African poverty line. And I think that's important because, you know, you could look at this and say, well, is Cape Town a good example of a developing country or a developing country environment? It's very much a first world city. I think the important thing is that there's a real spread within the population, and as 36% roughly of the population were below the poverty line, I think there's certainly an important case to make to ensure that those citizens are actually treated well and that their land rights are actually respected. So looking at the summary then in terms of some of the key factors, and there's obviously a lot more detail in the full report. I would just highlight a number of things. I mean, the first is on the area of increased productivity and efficiency, which is the area where you would expect to see significant gains. I mean, frankly, if you were implementing an IT system and you weren't seeing improvements in that area, I think you would very much question your spend. So in some ways, finding improvements and benefits in that area is not a surprise. What was surprising to me and the team was the level of those benefits. For example, the reduction in turnaround time was really very significant, from 20 days down to 5 days, so a 75% reduction. And that had a corresponding impact on the cost of actually conducting valuations, and also the number of staff that were required to be commissioned to actually undertake an evaluation, both of which generated significant cost savings for the city. And of course, the savings that you make on administrative programs like these are resources that are available to be spent on service delivery or other programs of priority. So taking out administrative cost is actually a very, very important way that governments can actually contribute to improving service delivery. I think the second thing that I would flag, and I think is a very important one, is that the time for dealing with objections was reduced from 3 months to, in many cases, just a few days, in many cases less than 10 days. And I think that's really important, because when people, particularly people from disadvantaged communities, are actually faced with problems with their valuation, having this hanging over them for months on end without knowing what the impact is going to be on them and their family is clearly something that you want to avoid. So that is not just an administrative saving. I think it's something that has a genuine impact on citizens. I think looking more broadly then, I think the reduction of lead time in conducting the valuations and actually dealing with objections means that the revenue department in Cape Town is able to receive much more frequent and much more timely valuations. That means that the link that Chris was talking about between tax that is levied and the perception of the social contract and the fairness of that is actually enhanced. I think the second thing I would flag there is that, interestingly, the authentication of ownership is something that can be carried out much more quickly, and that allows transactions to proceed more quickly and more smoothly. Where we found then some findings which I found particularly interesting, and that the team found very interesting, was that how people in the communities were actually using the data and the property valuation data, being more objective, consistent and transparent, was actually having an impact on individuals' ability to actually use the property and the property documentation to obtain loans, to obtain collateral, etc., whether that be to fund their children's education or indeed to improve their property. And we also found that there were considerable improvements in customer satisfaction as a result of the timely evaluation and the fact that people were having uncertainty removed. Moving on then to improving transparency and accountability, which I think is another important aspect in the social contract. Prior to the system being implemented, there was a very significant backlog to be processed. So it wasn't just a question of dealing with the immediate valuations and the length of time required to deal with those. There was also a very significant backlog of both valuations and objections to be dealt with. And clearly that has a negative impact on people's perception in terms of the fairness and the equity of the system. I think the other thing that I would flag there is the increased level of confidence among the citizens of the process. And I think that also is a valuable benefit. Moving on just finally to one last area then, which is the increase in accuracy. I think using the computerized system has clearly led to a significant reduction in the number of errors. Not only the number of errors, which are down by about 25% since the system was implemented, but also a significant reduction in the number of objections as well. And again, I think that's important. So you've got accurate, timely information which is being processed quickly that people actually recognize and see as being fair and equitable, and that really helps to underpin the process and the social contract. Some slightly unexpected benefits was how the data was actually being used by the city. And one area that was very interesting is that the Transport Department was starting to look at the data that was provided on patterns of dwelling and look at how that could be fed into their process of actually looking at transportation planning. Similarly, I think one thing I would flag is that there's a lot more data that the city have that they currently don't access from the system, and I think that's an area that the department is actually looking at quite strongly. One final point I would make, as you might expect, given that it is a valuation tool, was the impact on actual revenues. And I think it would be fair to say that you couldn't certainly attribute all of the improvement to the system. Clearly, rising property values and indeed policy changes by the city had an impact. But I think it's fair to say that having a system which enabled you to have good and accurate and timely information certainly contributed to quicker payment and increased revenues over the period of time. So I think overall I would say it was a very interesting piece of work for our team to undertake. Not least because of the much broader impacts that we were able to see. And I think the thing that was interesting to me about this was that very often when you look at issues, there's a perception of what you should find. I think what was interesting was going in with very much an open mind to actually see what we would find and finding things that frankly surprised us as we went along. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Trevor and Chris. Very informative presentations. So we've already got questions coming in, so we can jump right in. The first question here says, many studies in sub-Saharan Africa shows that having a title on land does not provide incentive for a sustainable use. Should titling land not be an issue which should be country-specific depending on the land tenure system in place? And I'll leave it to either of you to jump in on that one.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Many studies in sub-Saharan Africa show that having a title on land does not provide incentive for a sustainable use. Should titling land not be an issue which should be country-specific depending on the land tenure system in place?
Well, I would go back to, this is Chris Barlow here, I would go back to the study that I had just referenced in relation to Benin that the World Bank had released just this past October. And although that land, as referenced in that study in Benin, had not been formalized, the process of land tenure security had begun through the demarcation, so the mapping of property boundaries and the location of those parcels. And that belief that that information provided more security to those farmers in Benin had led them to make decisions in terms of how they were going to invest in their land. And the decisions that they, as proven through this World Bank study, decisions that they had made in relation to their investment was, we're going to have a longer-term outlook on the productive capacity of this land, meaning that we're going to invest in cash crops that will yield more revenue into the future because we are more secure that this land is not going to be appropriated. Inversely, I've seen studies out of China that had pointed to land tenure insecurity and the fact that more rural farmers were investing more in quicker short-term results, specifically the use of more fertilizers, so that they could yield a greater return on their crop. So I'm not quite sure what these studies are that are being referenced to the question and that was posed, but certainly some of the studies that I have seen or have been a part of shows examples of improved capacity for land based on tenure security.
Yeah. Great. So our second question here is, land markets and urbanization have taken away prime agricultural land. Land is now used for industrial and residential purposes. what happens to women who rely on community land, which they access through negotiations and bargains?
I don't really have a response to the second part of the question. I'm not per se a gender expert. When it comes to investment decisions on a microeconomic level, and I can say that land use changes are not something that's specific only to the developing world context. Certainly, there's very good examples of land use changes in our cities around this city that we're sitting in, Washington, D.C. And if you look at outskirts of Washington, D.C., there's zoning decisions and policy that is made by governments to purposely protect agricultural lands. And these are policy decisions that are made. We see this playing out, for instance, in China as well, where there's intense pressure on lands in China, and there is great debate within the Chinese government of how and what measures to take to better protect agricultural lands and to subsidize those people so that they retain those lands for agricultural purposes rather than selling those lands. This is a scenario that plays out in every country in the world, regardless of one stage of industrial modernization.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add to that answer, really. I think this is an absolutely critical area, and I think there's just two things I'd point out, really. One, there's a difference between policy and your implementation tools, and I think this is very much a policy question, and I think it is a critical question because if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, today the population is about 1.1 billion people. The sort of projections that we're seeing at the moment suggest by 2050 at current growth rates, population will be something like 2.5 billion people, with up to 60% of the population living in cities. Now, if that is the case, that's going to lead to massive growth in both the number and the size of the cities with the attendant infrastructure. And clearly that's going to have a huge impact on communities. And I think it's an area where governments in the region, but also supported by development agencies and other actors, really need to start looking very hard at what needs to be done, what the priorities are, how we can actually look at the communities that are potentially going to be affected by that, what are going to be the impact of that for women in particular, but also what is the impact of that going to be in terms of the positive side, the economic growth, the job creation, and the ability to actually absorb the burgeoning youth population. And there are clear challenges, and there are some very difficult policy debates to be dealt with there. Not only just the policy debates, but also the issue, of course, of how all of this investment is going to be funded and how that's going to be done in a way, and indeed how it's going to be powered in a way which actually uses sustainable energy and has a minimal impact, or as minimal impact as it possibly can, on the communities that are involved in it.
So, yeah. Trevor, to that point, then, wouldn't you see that there's great danger in continuing with this sort of current context where many governments in many developing countries are simply flying blind because there aren't well-defined rights. There isn't a clear picture of the fabric of land ownership and overlapping and intersecting rights. Without that clear picture, getting a handle on how to make smart decisions when it comes to agricultural policy is that much more impaired.
No, I would absolutely agree with that, but I think it's very important to also look at customary rights as part of that process and ensure that you're not just implementing a standard model, but one that's actually owned in the country and reflects the reality, the cultural and the customary sort of significance in that environment. Because I think if you don't do that, you're actually undermining existing systems and actually storing up problems for the future.
Great. So let's move on now to a question specifically on the Cape Town study. So this is directed towards you, Trevor. Regarding the Cape Town study, what was the basis on which the property tax was calculated? How long had property tax been collected in Cape Town prior to the project? And what public awareness programs accompanied the implementation?
Okay. The first thing I would say is that wasn't really what we were looking at. We were actually looking specifically at the impact of installing the piece of software. So we were not looking back at how the basis on which the property tax was calculated had changed over time. In terms of how it had been collected prior to that, it had been very much a manual process. In terms of public awareness, I think, Chris, I would probably turn to you on what public awareness programs the City of Cape Town ran around the implementation of the new program.
Well, I mean, the number one thing here in terms of public awareness campaigns was that the city was dealing with a problem of a high rate of appeals on the valuations. You know, that property tax payers, the citizens, were objecting how the government had actually come up with valuations that were based on the rates that they were paying. So one of the critical aspects of this project is that we introduced what's called computer-assisted mass appraisal, so that the values could be captured in a shorter period, a shorter time cycle, which would be more reflective of the market rates in Cape Town. And also we introduced systems and processes in which those rates could be shared with the public, so a citizen could online query what their rate that they were paying and their assessed value to that of their neighbor. And this is incredibly important in relation to the social contract. Myself, as a person that pays property tax, if I'm paying the same property tax that my neighbor is, similar location, similar characteristic of the house, and I understand that there's transparency of how that valuation was calculated, then I believe that's a fair process. If that's not transparent to me, if I understand I'm paying way more property tax than that of my neighbors or all of my neighbors, obviously I'm going to be upset by that.
Yeah.
So the introduction of better processes, newer technologies, to the public led to those improvements.
Yeah, yeah. I think many might see South Africa as an emerging market economy as opposed to a developing country. So this brings us to the next question. How do you see this being replicated in developing countries or other places?
Okay. I mean, I think, as I said at the very start, I mean, the thing that struck me as being very interesting was that a private sector company that was actually carrying out a program in a country was prepared to actually look at how the project was actually achieving its impacts and how those impacts, what those impacts were and how they were extending beyond just immediately the obvious impacts in terms of efficiency and effectiveness gains. I think that's certainly something that companies could actually look at doing as they impact in developing, as they implement large-scale projects in developing countries. And certainly when we look at areas such as land management or indeed computerization of government accounts, computerization of government finance systems, I would think they're very much areas where I would certainly encourage both governments and their private sector suppliers to actually look at the baseline situation, to really understand what they're actually looking at and look at the impact, not just the planned impact, but also the unintended impact. Some of that may be positive, some of that would be negative. If you don't put in place a baseline and you don't have a clear view of the impacts that you expect and you don't actually carry out any measurement or monitoring evaluation, and you don't actually learn from that, you're really likely to repeat the same mistakes. And I think some of the questions that we've been receiving to date, which focus on areas of sort of customary systems, I think it's very important to understand that, if you're buying a software system, it needs to be adapted to the environment in which you're operating, whatever sort of system it is. And it's vitally important that anything that you implement is actually done in a way that actually is to the benefit of the community in which it's operated. Because if you fail to do that, it loses its legitimacy. And as we know really from around the world, if people don't believe the tax systems are legitimate, then the levels of payment are not as high as they would otherwise be. And I would just want to emphasize this isn't just about payment. I mean, there have been a number of statements by both me and Chris that relate to that. I think the important thing with this is land tenure and security of tenure, and particularly when you look at women. There are many, many countries around the world where land rights and tenure rights for women are really very, very opaque. And I think it's very clear that where those rights have been codified, where those rights are clearly documented, I think that is very much to a benefit of the community as a whole and contributes to inclusive and sustainable growth in those communities, because it's absolutely clear, as I think one of the earlier questions mentioned, that women have a very, very significant role to play in many communities, and frankly, their contributions are very often understated. I suspect a lot of the evidence is very much understated, and the contributions are much, much greater than is apparent from the body of knowledge at the moment.
Yeah, I would just like to build on what Trevor had said. Very much, first of all, when it comes to the purpose of us having engaged with KPMG on the study, it's very much what Trevor had stated, that we understand that we need to work with our governments as partners to better prepare and project for gains and results. And I think and believe that the study is very much helping us accomplish that. So, how can we better work and support our government customers as they begin a modernization effort when it comes to the use of technology? A second issue here is that, this is not just a matter of unpacking a box of software and dropping it in to a government. That's not the case in any context anywhere in the world. Rather, the systems is really a reflection of the process improvements. So, much of what we do is looking at how current operations are conducted, so how land is currently registered or valued, and how they may be improved, and then using technology to aid in that improvement. I had mentioned in my presentation that this very much relies upon a solid foundation of good land administration. In the case of Cape Town, they had a very solid legacy of well-recorded rights and processes to record and at least to begin to value, and they had a professional association and they had professional accreditations and bodies in South Africa that existed well before we had been engaged with government there. We work in and have worked in other environments where that land administration foundation is very rudimentary. And there are approaches that can be taken in those circumstances that can improve the initial processes, the initial capture of those rights and documentation and mapping of those rights. So that foundation can be, start to be laid. I'd just like to add one point about gender as well. Yeah. Trevor mentioned in many cases there's opaque rights. I would take that a step further. In many circumstances, there are actually exclusionary processes and customs when it comes to recording a woman's right to land, and that there are ways in which, and we've done this through our technology in collaboration with local communities and local governments, that the systems can be set up so it's ensured that both heads of households, both a female and a male head of household, are on those land titles, which is very important when it comes to the courts and adjudicating on rights.
I just wanted to pick up one point that I think that one of in one of the earlier questions that I think it's worth going back to in terms of how do you make sure that systems and new approaches are relevant and have ownership within the community. One of the things I know that a number of development agencies are doing is they're looking for much more community-led approaches. And one that strikes me as being a very interesting one that I'll probably just plug for a second, the UK Department for International Development has actually just launched a program called Land Enhancing Governance for Economic Development, or LEGEND for short. And they have actually just launched a challenge fund which supports the development and testing of innovative approaches and partnerships for strengthening land governance, with a specific focus on developing pilot approaches for responsible land-related investment, which I think comes back to one of the points that somebody made earlier about how do you make sure these investments are indeed responsible. And that particular program, which I believe has just launched, is focusing on 7 countries in Africa: Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, Tanzania, Zambia, and Sierra Leone. And just recently, a challenge fund is actually being launched under that program, which aims to improve land rights protection, knowledge, information, and responsible land investment. So it would be very much, if it's an area that you're particularly interested in, it would be very much worth taking a look at that. That's one example from DFID. There are many others from USAID and other agencies where I think they're looking very much to use things like challenge funds to make sure that the solutions that are being developed are solutions that are actually being developed within the communities themselves, and that the community feels that they are appropriate, that they're developed generally on a small basis, on a pilot basis, and then really scaled up as they're seen to be effective.
Great. And then just to back up, here's another question. For the 70% of land not tenured in developing countries, which I believe, Chris, you had mentioned, who holds the title? Is it the government, a tribe, unknown, corporation?
Well, that's $1 million question. In that, that's the point, that there is not clarity around 70% of lands.
Yeah.
You could have customary rights. It's never been documented, recorded, or mapped. So in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of the legal statutory environment, it doesn't exist, perhaps, Yeah. It's very common in a lot of countries, and I'd like to say this country as well, the United States, that oftentimes you'll have overlapping rights of government control or interest on the same lands. Yeah. So you may have forest lands that have one ministry within government claiming some sort of right onto it, and another ministry has a competing right, and then you may have a customary group that has existed on that land for generations. So that lack of clarity is a very serious issue in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that I absolutely agree with that. I think it really is critical, and I think particularly at the moment in Africa, with the potentially massive increase in population that I mentioned, there really needs to be a tremendous degree of clarity in terms of who actually owns land, because there is a danger of uncontrolled development otherwise. It's very important for countries and communities to have clear title, to understand exactly who owns the land, to understand the implications of this, which, if you look in many countries in Africa, particularly where land is used for pastoral use, there's potentially, traditional medicine, there's traditional community engagement, there's community grazing on parcels of land which are owned by the community. It's very, very important to establish ownership over that. I mean, we can see, if you look back at the history in the US in the past, with all the land runs and all the rest of it, there's a history of what happens when clear title is not established. I think I've watched too many cowboy films since I've been here, actually. But it certainly offers the opportunity, and I think now is a very clear time. I think for 2 reasons, really. One, in terms of protection of individuals and protection of communities. But I think more generally, if we're going to see very significant and sustainable and inclusive economic growth and economic development in Africa particularly, which is going to lead to an absorption of the growing numbers of young people into the labour market, that needs to be done in a planned way. And from a private sector point of view, if you're talking about investment, the first thing you want to know is who owns the land you're going to build on. If that title is not clear, then it certainly will delay the process, if not derail it altogether. So it's a very, very important element, both for individuals, for communities, but also for investors.
Yeah. So this next question is, what impact does land tenure security have on the willingness of financial institutions, both regulated and unregulated, to invest in housing development and improvement in low-income areas?
Well, I think that really builds on the answer that I've just given. I mean, investors in housing are in many ways a class of investors, same as all the other investors. I mean, we've all seen press release over the last few years in Spain and other countries where properties were built, the title was not clear, and the properties have ultimately ended up being knocked down. That happened in India. When I lived in India, I saw examples of property being built on government land, and subsequent to a change of government, that property being demolished. So, you know, bricks and mortar is not always necessarily a solid investment unless you know about the land that you're building it on. And I think, yeah, I mean, just one of the points I would add to that in terms of investors, I think it's very important to actually make sure that your development is planned, because, you know, whether it be a city in Europe or whether it be a city in the US or a city in Africa or a city in Asia, I think the sort of environmental aspects of building those cities in terms of access to water, in terms of sort of land degradation, and in terms of green belts are very, very important aspects that actually need to be looked at, considered, and actually built into the process, rather than just sort of piecemeal development, which very often is not the best solution for the community, for the investors, or indeed more generally for society.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. You know, when it comes to investment decisions, too, we last year had an event I had referenced before with the former Minister of Finance from Nigeria, Ngozi, who was the former executive director at the World Bank, and we were speaking about inclusive growth and development at this event with the minister, and she had very interesting remarks. She estimated that in Nigeria that there was a current demand that was not fulfilled for 17 million households in Nigeria, and that according to her estimates, that for each household being constructed, that represented 5 to 6 jobs in Nigeria. And that's where, before in this webinar, I had referenced that 3% of the Nigerian economy is attributable to the real estate industry, whereas in many industrialized countries, it's greater than 20, upwards to 30%. So she had, under her direction and under her policy, had that year introduced a national mortgage finance corporation so that individuals could receive loans to purchase new houses, because most people in the world cannot afford to pay cash for new houses. But she said a major stumbling block was land administration, being able to sort out actually who had clear title and legal title to what lands, and that was a major hindrance in Nigeria. And she had referenced a number of states in Nigeria, states that we had been working with that had made rapid progress in terms of modernizing the way in which land was administered, including the registries and cadastral systems.
Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Prior to this project in Cape Town, was corruption in the valuation process and dispute process a problem? If so, does implementing the software have any noticeable impact on corruption, whereby government officials receive bribes during the valuation dispute process?
I mean, that's not something that we specifically looked at during the program, but certainly our experience from working on development projects in many, many countries has been that where you actually computerize a system and you build in controls, you build in transparency, particularly if you adopt a sort of an open government or open data type approach where the information is more made available to citizens and communities, it certainly makes the opportunity for corruption much less. I saw that in one country recently where we worked on a public financial management project, and the advent of actually computerizing the payroll process actually dramatically reduced the opportunity for sort of rent-seeking behaviors. And I think the more you actually have systems in place with clear processes, with clear oversight and clear transparency, it does reduce the opportunity for that sort of behavior.
Yeah, very much clarity around information in any marketplace allows for greater market efficiencies. That's not specifically the land markets, as Trevor had just brought up. Yeah. We see this play out in the implementation of technology very commonly. Going back to Finance Minister Ngozi, it's very interesting that before we actually had done this event last year with her, she had published a column in the Financial Times, an editorial in the column. In that, she argued that information technology and processes allows for greater, what she referred to as codification of governance. So meaning that the systems actually reflect more processes, and also the systems allow for greater transparency at different levels of government. So how that plays out is that there's specific codes written into the software where procedures have to be followed, including the collection of money for land titles, or the stated amount that should be collected, or whether or not it was actually collected, or the chain of title on a particular property. We have found, and this is not the case in Cape Town, but in engagement with other governments, we have been asked whether or not we could manipulate the audit trails that show chain of title, which is a serious issue and something that we cannot do, because in essence you're changing the way in which the system would actually be registering who had that right to that land.
Interesting.
It is a very significant issue.
And I'm sorry to have to cut you off. We've actually reached the end of our time frame for the webinar, but thanks to both of you for joining us, and to everyone for joining us online. We really hope that you enjoyed the conversation. There was a lot of activity on Twitter during the discussion, so be sure to follow and join the conversation using #DevWebinar. If you were not able to answer your question, feel free to submit your questions to webinars@devex.com, and we'll do our best to have your questions answered. If you want to watch the webinar again, we will be emailing it to you next week and posting it on devex.com, so look out for that in the near future. And again, thanks to Chris and Trevor for taking the time to speak with us. On behalf of Devex, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope you will join us for our next online event.